Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Bart Streumer. He is Professor and Vice Dean at the Faculty of Philosophy at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. His expertise is in metaethics and ethics, and today we're going to talk about that. So, Dr. Streumer, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on, and sorry for butchering your name.
You did very well, actually. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, so let's talk about metaethics then. What
Yes.
kinds of questions does it deal with? Because, I mean, people who are not philosophers, professional philosophers, who haven't studied really philosophy in university or somewhere like that, probably have heard of ethics, but not exactly metaethics. So, what is it about?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So maybe the best way to start is by getting it clear what metaethics focuses on. So what the topic is. And the topic of metaethics is morality. And morality is something that I think we're all familiar with. So we all sometimes think that, something that someone is doing is wrong or is right, or we sometimes think that we're morally required to do something or that there are moral reasons to do something. And so those thoughts and also the influence that those thoughts have on our behavior, all of that together constitutes morality. And that's obviously something that's very important to us, that sort of structures our lives in a certain way and that structures what we do. And it's something that we're all familiar with, I think. And then in philosophy, there are two different parts of philosophy that focus on morality. On the one hand, there's ethics, and ethics sort of tries to systematize morality in a certain way. So it asks questions about which things are right and wrong, what do we have an obligation to do, and why are those things right and wrong, and why do we have the obligations that we have? And so it tries to systematize our moral thoughts in a certain way, you might say. So that's ethics. And then we get to metaethics. So metaethics is the part of philosophy that you might say asks philosophical questions about ethics and about the nature of morality. And then there are two broad kinds of questions that metaethics asks. So the first kind of question is when you have a moral thought, so when you think that something is right or wrong, for example, what kind of thought is that? Is that a belief? So is it the kind of thought that tries to represent the world as being a certain way, that tries to accurately reflect something that's the case in the world? Is it that kind of thought? Is it a belief? Or is it maybe some kind of attitude that doesn't try to represent the world? So maybe it's some kind of attitude of approval or disapproval, or maybe it's some kind of plan. Maybe that's what we're doing when we're having a moral thought. So, for example, I might think that lying is wrong, and then one possibility is that in thinking that lying is wrong, I'm representing lying as being a certain way. Maybe I'm ascribing a feature to lying. I'm saying of lying that it is a certain way, namely that it has this feature or property of being wrong. That's one possibility. Or maybe I'm just voicing my disapproval of lying, or I'm expressing a plan to never tell lies or something like that. So those are the two main possibilities. So that's the first question. What is the nature of moral thought? And that's obviously a very important question. Maybe it's not so important in itself, but it's important because of what it's about, because morality is important. And then there's a second question that is also a very broad question that people are asking in metaethics. And that's a question that really only arises if, or at least it only arises in a certain way, if moral thoughts are beliefs. Because if moral thoughts are beliefs, then they try to represent something in the world. So they try to, for example, represent lying as having the property of being wrong. And then we can ask questions about whether there actually is such a thing in the world. Is there a property of being wrong? Is it really, can lying have a certain moral character that's independent of what we think, right? So then there are questions about what's the case in the world, and also what would have to be the case to make a moral thought true if it's trying to represent reality as being a certain way. So that's a second broad kind of question that metaethics asks. And then I should perhaps say, so a lot of metaethics is very technical academic philosophy in a certain way. And so I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, but it does help to keep in mind that the underlying issue in metaethics, so the reason why metaethics is important and interesting, is that really we want to know something about the status, I think, that morality has. So is it objective in a certain way? Is it binding in a certain way? What does it mean to say that it's objective, right? So there are lots of things that might mean. And that's, I think, that kind of question, so the objectivity and the potential bindingness of morality, that's the holy grail of metaethics, answering that question. That's always behind all this technical discussion and all this jargon, and that's why I think it's important and interesting.
Mm-hmm. So in metaethics, as far as I know, you use terms like moral concepts, moral truths, moral facts. What are these, and are there differences between them? And if so, what would those be?
Yeah, that's also a very good question. So I think there it helps to keep in mind this some of the distinctions I just drew between different answers that we might give to these questions. So what is the nature of moral thoughts? And is there anything in reality that can make those thoughts true? And if so, what is the nature of whatever there is in reality that can make the thoughts true, if the thoughts are beliefs? So those things that you mentioned, so concepts and truth and facts and so on, the distinction behind that, I think, that's important in metaethics is to do with whether morality is ultimately, and maybe you might say the normative force of morality, whether that is something that ultimately we can locate in the world, and then it's something to do with facts or states of affairs or things having certain properties and so on. And so if that's the case, then we might talk about moral facts and moral properties and moral states of affairs and so on, then it's in the world. Or it might be something in our minds and in our language, and then it's something to do with our attitudes or with our concepts and so on. So in general, a concept is just whatever we express when we use a certain word, you might say. And obviously there are different philosophical theories about what exactly concepts are. That's a big question in itself, but that is broadly what a concept is. So the concept, wrongness is whatever is expressed by the word wrong. A fact, I guess, is generally, not always, but generally used to mean a certain part of the world that might be represented by a belief. So if we think there are moral facts, then we might think that it's a fact that lying is wrong, for example. And then the thought that lying is wrong is a belief that represents that fact, and the belief is true if that really is a fact, and false if it's not really a fact. And so truth is, again, a huge philosophical topic in itself. So there are many different theories of truth, and there are people who say, well, different kinds of truth apply to different areas of thought and discourse. But one way in which truth is relevant in metaethics is that if you think that moral thoughts are attempts to represent the world, then you're probably going to think that a moral thought is true if it accurately represents the world, and false if it doesn't accurately represent the world. So then truth obtains in virtue of a certain kind of relation, a kind of correspondence relation, or a kind of accurate representation relation that obtains between a moral fact and, between a moral thought and a moral fact. So a lot of this is kind of technical philosophical jargon, and then there are further philosophical theories about what exactly this is, and it very quickly gets very complicated. But I think it helps to keep in mind this general division in metaethics between, on the one hand, the people who say morality is in some sense independent of us and can be found in the world, and our moral thoughts are true if they accurately reflect that kind of moral reality that's out there. So that can sound kind of outlandish, but maybe that's something that we're committed to, and maybe it's there. So that kind of line, or the line where you say, maybe sometimes it seems like it's out there in the world, but ultimately it's a matter of our own attitudes. And that too is a view that there are good arguments for. So the difficulty in metaethics is to choose between those two broad lines, and then work them out in a way that's plausible and that sort of fits the phenomena as we experience them.
And how does one determine that something is a moral fact, for example? Of course, I mean, this might be a simplistic way of thinking about things. I'm not a philosopher, and perhaps you use certain terms with a particular meaning and scientists would use them with another meaning. But I mean, isn't there a difference, for example, between saying that there's something out there like an atom and really gathering evidence that they exist and how they work, etc., and saying that something is a moral truth? I mean, how do we determine it? Because it doesn't seem to me to be something out there in the world to be found that we could call a moral truth or a moral fact or something like that.
Yeah, so I agree with you, and I think that this language of it being out there in the world and so on that I've just been using myself, it's kind of a metaphor, right? It's kind of imprecise, and you're absolutely right. So we'd want to know more about the sense in which these moral facts are supposed to be out there, and then it really matters what the precise view is that we have in metaethics. So if we want to, so the question is how, so suppose that there are moral facts, how do we find out what these moral facts are, right? That's the question. Yeah. And then it really matters what you say as a metaethicist about what exactly the nature of those moral facts is. So there are people in metaethics who say moral judgments, moral thoughts are beliefs. They try to represent the world as being a certain way. And the moral facts that those thoughts try to represent are natural facts. So they're facts just like the facts that the natural sciences and the social sciences and biology might discover. So they're the kinds of facts that we can discover empirically. So that's one broad view, and that view is known as naturalism or naturalist realism, as it's often called, because it's a realist view about the existence of the properties, and then it says that, and the facts. And then it says that the nature of the facts is that they are natural facts, so they're facts that we can discover empirically. And then, of course, you might wonder, well, how do we discover those facts empirically? Because normally, if I want to find out whether lying is wrong, I wouldn't ask a physicist or someone who does chemistry or biology or something. I would just think about it, or at least that's what it seems like. But what these philosophers often say is that given that moral facts are natural facts, they have causal powers, so they can play a role in causal explanations of things. So it might be that the fact that lying is wrong plays a role in a causal explanation of why I believe that lying is wrong. And maybe then the way for me to find out that lying is wrong is to discover the right causal explanations of whatever moral beliefs I have, and maybe also discover potential causal explanations of other moral beliefs that I don't have yet, or something like that. I mean, it's a little unclear how exactly that would work, but it would have to be something like that. And then they might also say, well, actually, the fact that lying is wrong also might play a role in other causal explanations. So why is it that all across the world, in all these different cultures, people tend to think that in many circumstances, at least, lying is wrong? Well, maybe that's because, maybe the explanation for that is that it really is a fact that lying is wrong, and that fact causes people to generally think that. So you might also give larger scale explanations, causal explanations, in which the fact that lying is wrong plays a role. So if that view is right, I mean, it's not a view I myself believe, but if that view is right, then it would, at least in principle, be possible to discover that a certain moral fact obtains in a way that's not too dissimilar from how we discover that certain facts obtains in the social sciences, for example. So that's one potential view. Now, I have to say that to me, personally, it's a little bit murky how exactly that is supposed to work. So, and it doesn't really seem to fit with how I myself think when I try to find out whether something is right or wrong. So it doesn't seem like I'm thinking about causal explanations or about what causes my beliefs. But maybe that appearance might be mistaken. So maybe there is something to be said for that kind of view. So that's one view. So one view is moral facts are just natural facts, and so we can discover them empirically. Another view, which is known as non-naturalist realism, also says that our moral thoughts are beliefs that try to represent the world as being a certain way, so that try to represent moral facts. But that view says that moral facts are non-natural facts. So the first view said they are natural facts, so we can discover them empirically, and the second view says they're non-natural facts. And what they mean by that is that we can't discover them empirically, but instead we'll have to discover them purely by thinking. And again, it's a little bit unclear how exactly that's supposed to work, but it does seem to fit with how we normally think about morality, or at least I think it's a better fit with how we normally think about morality. So the thought here is something like, you start by, well, if you want to answer a moral question and you're genuinely unsure about what to think, then you start by thinking about very general potential moral truths. So a very general truth might be an action is wrong whenever it fails to maximize happiness or something like that. So that's a view in ethics that's known as utilitarianism. So you might think an action is right if and only if it maximizes happiness, and an action is wrong if and only if it fails to maximize happiness. And then the thought of the non-naturalist realist usually is something like, well, that kind of very, very general moral claim might be self-evident in the sense that understanding what the claim says, so understanding what the words mean, and having sufficient acquaintance with what the claim is about, so having some acquaintance with happiness, probably by yourself having been happy or unhappy at various times. So those two things together, understanding what the claim says and having sufficient acquaintance with what the claim is about, those two things together give you sufficient justification for believing the claim. And the parallel that these philosophers often draw is with, for example, mathematics, right? So I mean, I think you were quite right to say it doesn't seem like the fact that lying is wrong, for example, is out there in the world in a real sense, like empirical facts are sort of intuitively out there in the world. That's right. But we might say, well, it's also a fact that 1 + 1 = 2, for example. And that too is a fact that doesn't quite seem to be out there in the world in the same sense in which empirical facts are. That too seems to be a fact that we don't discover empirically. So we don't do natural or social science to discover it, but we just do pure mathematics. So we just understand what the claim says, and just understanding what the claim says seems to be sufficient justification for believing the claim. So that is what those other philosophers, so non-naturalist realists, take as their model, you might say, when it comes to discovering what the moral facts are. Now, of course, the problem is that we have lots of disagreements about what the moral facts are. We don't have many disagreements about mathematics, and certainly not about simple things like 1 + 1 = 2. So opponents of non-naturalist realism will immediately point out that it's a bit too easy to say that those very general moral claims are self-evident if we disagree about them. So what we'd want, in order to be able to call this knowledge, maybe, what we would want is a way to decide which moral claims really are self-evident, given that we disagree about what they are. And that is very, very hard to do.
Mm-hmm. Yes, because there are some views held by metaethicists that I find really hard to even grasp. Like, for example, when I hear people saying that there are in fact moral truths or moral facts out there, I don't know exactly where to be found, and they say that they are sort of mind independent. That is, even if humans, for example, didn't exist, they would still exist as facts, as if they were a property of the universe, like, I don't know, strong nuclear energy or gravity or something like that is. So, I mean, I find it really hard to understand something like that. I mean, moral facts as mind independent or something like that.
So I share your doubt. I'm not a realist. I share your doubts about the existence of these facts. But to be fair to these philosophers, I think the right parallel is to mathematical facts, because that is the sort of thing they have in mind.
Okay.
So they might say, so in reply to your doubts and to my doubts, they might say something like, well, these facts are mind independent and exist independently of the existence of human beings, in the same way in which the fact that 1 + 1 = 2 is mind independent and exists independently of human beings. And what that means isn't that there is some kind of deep metaphysics that's part of the tissue of the universe out there, just like the things you just mentioned. And that all would still have been there, out there, sort of almost touchable, even if human beings hadn't existed, right? That's not what they mean. They just mean, they would just say, well, just as it would have been true that 1 + 1 = 2, even if there had never been a human being who thought that 1 + 1 = 2, but it's just, it still would have been the case that 1 + 1 = 2. And even if the universe goes out of existence and there's no life anymore, it's still the case that 1 + 1 = 2, they would say. I mean, we might doubt that, but that's what they would say. And in that case, there's a certain plausibility to that thought, that the fact that 1 + 1 = 2 is completely independent of the existence of people who think that 1 + 1 = 2. And then they would say something like, well, given that we're willing to grant that this is fairly plausible and possible in the case of 1 + 1 = 2, why wouldn't we be willing to grant that in the case of an action is wrong if and only if it doesn't maximize happiness? Or maybe even more general moral thoughts like states of affairs that contain happiness are to that extent morally good, or something like that, right? So and another reason to think that it's not as implausible as it looks, is that these very general thoughts, these very general moral truths that are mind independent might have might have a conditional form, as it were. So they might have the form, if there is a state of affairs that contains happy people, then that state of affairs is to that extent morally desirable or morally good, or something like that. And so given that this truth has a conditional form, it doesn't seem so bad that conditional truth is still obtains, even if there's nothing that satisfies the first part of the conditional, because there are in fact no happy people, because the universe has gone out of existence and there are no people anymore. So I share your doubts, but I also think there's something to be said for it if we sort of try to get the right view on what exactly these people mean when they talk about things being out there and mind independent and so on. Mm-hmm. So does that help, or are you still sort of?
I mean, the analogy with mathematical truths, I understand it better now if it's that what they really mean. But I mean, it's still, because I'm more scientifically minded, it's still very hard to understand what that really means without human beings existing. So.
Yeah. And of course, you might say there are two huge weaknesses with this view, even given that comparison, right? So the first huge weakness is one that I've already mentioned, which is that we disagree about these general moral truths, right? And so maybe if it's very, very, very general, like states of affairs that contain happy people are to some extent morally desirable, something that's so general that maybe we agree about that, but that doesn't really tell us very much. Once it gets specific enough to give us moral guidance and to zoom in on particular actions that we have to do, then disagreement kicks in, and we all disagree about many people disagree about what those truths are. So that is the first big weakness. And of course, the second large weakness in this sort of view is that moral truths just seem to be in their subject matter connected to people and happiness and people's well-being and flourishing, and how we should treat other people and how we shouldn't treat other people. And given that that's their subject matter, it's kind of intuitively a bit weird perhaps to think that those truths would have obtained even if there had never been any people, and even if there had never been such a thing as happiness. And that might also be a difference between those truths and mathematical truths. So, I think your doubts are very reasonable.
Mhm. Yes, and another thing, if I may, of course, that I think is would be a challenge to moral realists in this case is, even if people were to agree at least in a certain minimum number of moral truths, let's say, like, I don't know, very general things like fairness, justice, equity, if we were to find that across all human societies and cultures people agreed on a basic number of moral truths. I mean, even if that's the case, I guess that one could argue that that's just contingent on the fact that we evolved this way, because if we had evolved, if we had been exposed to other sorts of evolutionary pressures and evolved other values, then it would have been different. And so it would still not make sense to talk about uh, mind-independent moral facts or moral truths, and even things related to agreement or disagreement, because from an evolutionary perspective, that doesn't seem to make much sense.
Absolutely. So that is so what you're mentioning now is another. This is one of the major arguments that people discuss in the metaethical literature. So we've obviously evolved. Morality is obviously something that, or well, it seems like it's something that's a result of evolution. That is, kind of moral systems obtain, or are, well, moral systems are instantiated by certain groups of beings, and they might have behaved in different ways, they might have evolved differently. And then you might say, well, what a coincidence that we, in the contingent way that, so we evolved in this way, we might easily have evolved in this different way, but we happen to evolve in this way. What a coincidence that we have more or less arrived at the moral truth that obtains independently of evolution. And if we had evolved in this different way, we would have missed the moral truth. And then you might think, well, this is what a happy coincidence for us. But you might also think, well, actually, maybe this is a bit suspicious, right? So maybe what's going on here is that really what we take to be the moral truths, what our thoughts are about what the moral truths are to a large extent determined, at least broadly speaking, by evolutionary processes. And if we think that we've arrived at the eternal mind-independent moral truths as they really are, then maybe that's just a kind of wishful thinking, right? So the theory of evolution might lead you to think that the thought that we are good at grasping mind-independent moral truths is a kind of wishful thinking, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, I hope I'm not offending anyone here, but, and I'm not religious, by the way, but I think that for me, it would make even more sense if there was a God that imbued the world with certain moral truths or something like that, than expecting to, just for the universe as it is, considering the possibility that there's no God, no divine entity out there that created this universe, just to be imbued itself with some moral truths that, I mean, as I said earlier, to be mind independent is something just mind boggling to me. So.
Yeah, but we might wonder whether the existence of God actually helps, because suppose that God did imbue the world with moral properties and made it true, for example, that lying is wrong. Then we might say, okay, but why did God what reasons did God have for doing that? And then there are two possibilities. Either he just did it, on a whim. This is just what he felt like. He made lying wrong, could easily have made lying right, but he just, on the day, he just decided, this is what I'll do. I'll make lying wrong. And then it seems like, well, if that's what he did, then this is not really, that's not objective, right? It's just a random decision taken by a supernatural being. That doesn't really help. So it seems like the better possibility is that God investigated the moral facts and found out that actually lying is wrong. And then he made the world in such a way that it contains the fact that lying is wrong. But then, of course, moral reality and moral facts would have to obtain independently of the existence of God. And then God is like, he just makes it the case that this obtains in the world, maybe, or makes it the case that we can find out that these are the facts, maybe. But really, the problem just, right? So really, the problem would just return. So I think you're right that for many people, it seems like the objectivity of morality is easier to understand if we connect it to religion and if we connect it to the existence of God. But if you really think it through, then maybe it doesn't, because either what God did was just arbitrary, or God himself based his decision on moral facts. So this is known as the Euthyphro dilemma, which was already discussed by Plato. And it's still like a classic philosophical argument to show that maybe God's existence doesn't help with these difficult questions. Even if he exists, it doesn't help with these particular questions.
Yeah, I mean, the main reason why I said that, for me at least, it would make more sense if things were that way than no God existing at all, would be that if the universe has certain physical properties, and if it just so happened that moral truths were part of it, I mean, if the creator of the universe imbued them into the rest of the physical reality, then I mean, at least people could argue that he made the rules and we would be playing by his rules. So
Yeah. But you don't think that about 1 + 1 = 2, I think, right? So you think that there, presumably, there's no problem. So yeah, so that's what a realist would then appeal to again, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, on the other hand, it could also be the case, and probably not many people consider this possibility, that God could be amoral. I mean, not care about morality at all, one way or the other. Right.
Yeah. I don't believe in God either, so I wouldn't know, but it seems like that is a possibility, yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, tell us a little more about your metaethical stance, if you have one, then.
Okay, yeah. So there I run into a problem, I guess, because my own personal stance is different from the sort of metaethical stance that I think is most defensible. So personally, I think that certain things are right and wrong. I think there are moral truths. I think this is to some extent objective. So I do think that generally speaking, lying is wrong and so on. So I have the same moral views as everybody else. But then I think that the theory that's most defensible in metaethics is a theory that's known as the error theory. And the error theory is a theory that says that moral thoughts are beliefs. So they are attempts to represent the world as being a certain way. And so, for example, the thought that lying is wrong is a belief. And in order for that thought to be true, lying really has to have the feature or property of being wrong. So to that extent, the view that I defend agrees with realism. So when it comes to moral thoughts, it agrees with realism. But then the error theory denies the existence of moral facts and moral properties. So the error theory says that the property of being wrong doesn't exist. So that means that nothing has it. So that means that lying in particular doesn't have it. So that means that it's not a fact that lying is wrong. And so that means that the thought that lying is wrong is a false belief, because it ascribes a property to something that the thing doesn't have, right? So just as if I say, this table that I'm sitting at is made of plastic, I'm ascribing a property to the table that it doesn't have because it's actually made of wood. In the same way, according to the error theory, if I say lying is wrong, I'm ascribing a property to lying that lying doesn't have, because the property doesn't, in that case, because the property doesn't exist at all. So that's the view that I think is most defensible. And the way I defend it is really by arguing against the other main views in metaethics. So the other main views are the two versions of realism that we've already talked about, and a view that's known as non-cognitivism or expressivism, which is the view that I mentioned at the beginning, the view that says that moral thoughts are attitudes that we have, like attitudes of approval or disapproval or plans or something like that. So I think there are major problems for all of these views, and I think that the only view that is then left standing is the error theory. But what I found is that once I sort of put all these arguments together in my head, and once I'd written them all down, I didn't come to believe the error theory. And in fact, I found that I just couldn't bring myself to believe the error theory. I couldn't bring myself to believe that whenever I have a moral thought, that thought is false. And I mean, partly that's because it's a very, very radical theory. So according to the theory, the thought that lying is wrong is false. The thought that lying is right is also false, because that also ascribes a non-existent property. The thought that lying is permissible is also false, because that also ascribes a property. So the theory really says that lying and all other actions and all other states of affairs that you might think of just don't have any moral status at all. So they're neither good nor bad, nor right, nor wrong, nor permissible, just nothing. And that itself is already something I think that is quite hard to believe. But anyway, so I found that I didn't come to believe the error theory and just kept having the same moral thoughts that I always had. And so that's why I started to think about what was really going on there. And my hypothesis is that we can't believe the error theory, and that's why I don't come to believe the error theory, even when I consider what I take to be the best arguments in metaethics, which are arguments against all the alternatives to the error theory. And so the hypothesis that I came up with, and I'm not sure it's right, but that's the hypothesis I defend in my book. The hypothesis is that the best arguments for the error theory are really arguments for a more general normative error theory. So that's an error theory that doesn't just apply to morality and moral thoughts, but that applies more generally to all what philosophers call normative thoughts. So normative thoughts are not just thoughts about moral rightness and wrongness and moral requirements and so on, but they're also thoughts about what's rational, or what we have reason to do, what we have reason to believe, and so on. So they're all thoughts about, you might say, what to do or what to believe. And so not just moral thoughts, but more generally, all normative thoughts. And then my hypothesis is that we can't believe that more general error theory, because that theory entails that we have no reason to believe anything, because the thought that we have a reason to believe something is a normative thought. And according to the theory itself, all normative thoughts are false. So the thought that we have a reason to believe something is false. So in particular, the theory entails that we have no reason to believe the theory itself, right? So it's like this very general normative theory says of itself that there is absolutely no reason to believe the theory. And then I think that we can't believe something if we at the same time explicitly believe that there is absolutely no reason to believe that thing, right? So for example, I can't believe that I don't think I can have the following belief: Socrates was a human being, and there is absolutely no reason whatsoever to believe that Socrates was a human being. So if I really believe that there is absolutely no reason whatsoever to have the first belief, the belief that Socrates was a human being, then I just can't form the belief, and I can't sustain the belief that Socrates was a human being, I think. So if that's true, if it's true that we can't have a belief and at the same time explicitly think that there is absolutely no reason whatsoever to have the first belief, then I think it follows that we can't believe the error theory, right? So the argument is the error theory entails that there's absolutely no reason to believe it, but we can't believe something and at the same time believe that there's no reason to believe it, and therefore we can't believe the error theory. And so that's the hypothesis. And if that's true, then that explains why, even after considering all these arguments, I don't come to believe the error theory. So that's my stance. So it's like, so I have a kind of everyday stance, which is just like everybody else. And then I have a philosophical stance, which is that the most defensible view is the error theory, but we can't believe that theory.
Okay, so, and what sort of implications would that have in the realm of metaethics, morality? I mean, if you still believe that we can tell what's right and what's wrong, how then?
Well, I think it has. So maybe I should start with the implications for metaethics, and then work from there to the to what implications it has for ethics.
Okay.
So in metaethics, I think the main implication of the unbelievability of the error theory is that in a way it makes the error theory easier to defend, and that's because I think that most of the reasons that people have given against the error theory rely on the implausibility of certain implications of the error theory, and ultimately really rely on the difficulty that we all have in believing the theory. So, for example, people often say, well, the error theory implies that torturing people for fun is not wrong, but it's very, very plausible that torturing people for fun is actually wrong. I mean, I think that's wrong. I'm sure you think that's wrong. We all think that's wrong. So that seems very, very plausible. So if the error theory entails that that's not the case, then it has a super implausible implication, and that so maybe that's a maybe we should therefore reject the theory. So if we can't believe the error theory, then you might respond to that the reason why, what explains why we all believe that torturing people for fun is wrong, is that we can't believe the theory that tells us that that's actually not the case, right? So the reason why we have very, very low confidence in the error theory and very, very high confidence in claims that contradict the error theory is that we can't believe the error theory. So of course we're going to have very, very low confidence that it's true. And of course we're then going to form beliefs and other things that are inconsistent with the error theory that we can easily have very high confidence in. So this is one example, but there are many cases, I think, where the unbelievability of the error theory helps to undermine objections that people have made to the error theory. So that's one effect in metaethics. I think it makes the error theory even more defensible than it otherwise would have been based on the arguments against the alternative to the theory. Another more general effect it might have on metaethics is that it might explain why in metaethics people have been going around in circles, you might say, for at least 100 years since the development of modern metaethics, but actually for far longer. So first, I guess maybe Plato was the first one to raise metaethical questions, so like the Euthyphro dilemma that we just talked about. And so philosophers and others have been thinking about this for a very, very long time, and they haven't actually reached a consensus on what the right view is. So if I'm right that we can't believe the error theory, and if I'm right that the best arguments in metaethics actually point to the error theory, then I have a very good explanation of why philosophers have been going around in circles without arriving at the correct view. And that's because the correct view is actually unbelievable, so we can never arrive there. And so the effect of that might be that we, obviously not that we come to believe the true view, because if I'm right, the true view is unbelievable, but we might sort of come to realize that this is what's going on, and then that might be the next best thing. Obviously it would be even better if we could believe the truth. But in this case, we can't, but we can also, but we can explain to ourselves why this is, and that might sort of put the debate to rest, you might say. So that in that sense, it might have a good effect in metaethics. I mean, obviously other philosophers wouldn't agree with that at all, but that's what I would regard that as a good effect. Okay, so but this is all at the level of theory, right? This is all philosophers talking to one another and thinking about what the right metaethical theory is. Then I think in ethics, so in just thinking about what the right thing to do is, I think it probably wouldn't have any effect, or at least it would have very little effect. So the effect that I've found that the effect on me of starting to think that the best arguments seem to be arguments for the error theory in metaethics, the effect on me was that my confidence in my moral judgments went down maybe a little bit. And that's because I can have a very small amount of confidence that the error theory is true. So I do think that's possible. I think the impossibility of believing it is only for a full explicit belief, not for low degrees of confidence and so on. And so I guess as an effect of that, my confidence in my particular moral judgments, my particular moral thoughts went down just a little bit, but it didn't have any effect on my behavior or my moral views, because all possible moral thoughts that I can have were affected in exactly the same way. So my confidence in all possible moral thoughts went down just a little bit in exactly the same way. So in practice, it didn't really have any effect. Now, so I would expect that to be the same. I mean, obviously I can't be sure, but I would expect that to be the same for other people if they become convinced that the best arguments in metaethics support the error theory. But then you started with, or at least one of the things you mentioned was, well, what would the effects be for how we should find out what the moral facts are, right? So this is the thing we talked about earlier. How do we find out? And there, I think it doesn't really help. So, or it doesn't help in the sense that it doesn't give us a way to find out. And that's obviously because the theory itself says that there are no such facts. So it would be very surprising if the theory then helped us to find out what those facts are. I guess what it might do is it might in a certain way perhaps, so realizing that these are the best arguments and realizing that we can't believe what the arguments really point to might sort of put to rest certain doubts that we have, or it might just reconcile us to what the situation is like. But I guess maybe to fully do that, we would have to downgrade our expectations a little bit. And we would have to say, well, morality is something that we all believe in. We can't come to believe the error theory and abolish morality on that basis. We'll just have to go on having our moral thoughts. We'll have to go on discussing these moral thoughts as best as we can. There are certain puzzles about how these thoughts can be objective and independent of our thoughts, and how we can find how the moral facts that these thoughts are about can be objective and independent of our thoughts, and how we can find out what they are. But maybe we should just let those puzzles rest and just get on with it as best as we can. So yeah, there it doesn't really help, I think.
Okay, so I have one last topic I would like to talk about. Of course, earlier in our conversation, when I put forth different challenges to moral realism, I was alluding to some moral anti-realist positions, like, for example, moral nihilism, moral relativism, moral abolitionism. What do you think about those sort of positions, particularly the ones that come more from theories and hypotheses in the social sciences and the evolutionary sciences? I mentioned, for example, just the fact that we were exposed to particular evolutionary pressures, and even if we all agree on a certain number of moral truths, that's just contingent on that fact. And then, I mean, when there's variability, we can also perhaps appeal to anthropology and political psychology, for example, and talk about culture or ecological factors, or even, for example, moral foundations coming from Jonathan Haidt and others, and several different basic psychological predispositions that different individuals might have, and that kind of thing. So, I mean, what do you think people who basically transport these theories from the social sciences to ethics and metaethics more specifically might get wrong?
Well, so the first thing I should say that I have huge sympathy for the sorts of metaphysical doubts that are driving people who import these theories, or people who go for certain versions of relativism, or even versions of non-cognitivism or expressivism. So one of the views I mentioned at the beginning. So these are all versions of anti-realism. And I share their metaphysical doubts about what realists believe in. So I share these metaphysical doubts about how can these moral facts be mind independent if we're just, if the way we behave is ultimately influenced by evolution. And so these doubts I share. And obviously the error theory is in that sense itself a version of anti-realism. So the view that I defend is also driven by those very same metaphysical doubts. But I think that where people who defend those views go wrong is that the views, so my view would be that they fail to take sufficiently seriously our own commitment to some kind of objectivity in ethics. So so to take a very simple example, I often encounter this when I teach ethics to first-year students. So, there will always be a sizable group, maybe 1/3 of the class or something, who will say things like, well, morality is all subjective, and it's all just a matter of our attitudes, and it's all relative and so on, which is like a similar sort of view, but at the level of undergraduates. And it's clearly something that's very prevalent in our culture and something that a lot of people believe in, probably based on these metaphysical doubts. But then I think it's often with undergraduates, it's quite easy to argue them out of this, because you can just give, like the obvious examples. Like, so for example, suppose that you're discussing moral questions with someone who's a neo-Nazi or someone who has just horrible moral views. Would you really think that in this case, it's just all a matter of opinion and it's all relative, and what's true for him or her, for the neo-Nazi, is different from what's true for you? And it's all a result of evolution, and this person says this and this person says that, and that's all there is to it. And students rarely feel that way. So they hold on to the metaphysical doubts, but they give up their relativism. Now, I should also say there are very sophisticated philosophical versions of relativism that do try to incorporate the thoughts that people have about the objectivity of morality. And those are very philosophically respectable views that might well be true. I think you can probably also do that while importing results from the social sciences and so on. But I guess my main view about all of this would be that I do think that we have a strong commitment to morality being objective. I think that is clearly there in the way we discuss moral questions, the way in which we take moral questions seriously, the way in which, when we have fundamental disagreements with others, we hold on to the thought that their views are mistaken in some way. Now, of course, once we try to flesh that out metaphysically and start thinking about moral facts, then we start to have doubts again about whether this is really the case. But still, this is a powerful impulse that we have, and any version of anti-realism, to be credible, has to make room for that, I think. And so ultimately, that is what drives me towards an error theory, or at least towards defending an error theory, rather than towards defending a version of relativism, because I think the error theory addresses the metaphysical problems by saying the same thing about the metaphysics that relativism and expressivism and other views say, namely that ultimately deep down there are no moral facts. But the error theory takes the views that I think we all implicitly have about the objectivity of morality much more seriously, I think, than these other views do. Even though I should say there are sophisticated versions that try to do that, still I think the error theory does better on that score.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that at least to some extent there could be parallels between discussions surrounding moral realism and discussions surrounding the existence of free will? Because I mean, people who say that based on scientific arguments that free will does not exist, they admit that people believe they have free will and they behave as if they have free will. But I mean, they say that there's no such thing out there as free will. So would it be more or less the same way when it comes to morality for the people who
Yeah,
use these kinds of arguments?
yeah, I think that's a very good point. And so, in fact, I became interested in metaethics after writing my PhD thesis on free will. And there too, I thought, well, the best way to sort of take our views on free will seriously is to say, while also having a plausible metaphysics, is to say that we can't help but believe in some form of free will that isn't really there, because the metaphysics can't be made to work in a coherent way. And so I think you're absolutely right. There's a strong parallel, on this point at least, between the debate about free will, I think, and the debate in metaethics. So in both cases, I think really taking seriously what people think, at least implicitly, and what our attitudes here are, at least implicitly, while also having a plausible metaphysics, should make us see the relevant phenomenon as a kind of illusion and as a kind of inescapable illusion. And in the metaethical case, I would say we can't even really fully believe that it's an illusion. Maybe that's also true in free will. I don't know, but maybe that's also true in free will. But there's definitely a strong, in that sense, there's a strong parallel here. So there are metaphysical doubts, but at the same time, there's a strong commitment in our thoughts and in our practices to the thing really being there. And maybe the best way to resolve all of that is to say, well, actually, it's a kind of inescapable illusion. And maybe we can never believe that that's the case, but that is maybe the best way of viewing it in both cases.
Mm-hmm. So before we go, would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Yeah, so I guess they could just Google my name and then they would find my website. So that's Streumer.net, Streumer.net, I think. And so there I have, there are copies of all of my papers. So also the papers that have been published in journals. If you want to access them, there's always an accessible copy on my website. I also have 2 papers on my website that are meant to be accessible to people who are just starting out in philosophy. So there at the bottom of the list of papers, there are 2 things that I've written for students. So one is called Are There Moral Truths, which is a general introduction to metaethics that I hope, I mean, it's always hard for me to write for non-philosophers, but at least the aim there is to make it accessible to non-philosophers. And there's also a paper outlining my views on the error theory in a way that's meant to be accessible. So those would be good places to start, I think.
Mm-hmm. And for people who might be interested, I think I would also mention your book, Unbelievable Errors, an Error Theory about All Normative Judgment. So I will be leaving also a link to it in the description box of the interview. And thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. It's been real fun to talk to you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Hello everybody, thank you for watching this episode until the end. To keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and consider making a pledge there, starting at $1 per month. You also have links to PayPal. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litska and Blanchett Perga, Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunder, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf, Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whiting, Bert Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windegar, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Colombo, Jorge Pinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguenzo, Michael Stormir, Samuel Andreff, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Unig, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Hal Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librant, Oslan Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Weira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londonio Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostaszewski, Alec Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Allman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmidis, Saima Afzal, Adrian Gagey, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litska, Denise Cook, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Todd Shackelford, and Sonny Smith. My producers is our web, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanag, Dam Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Muller, Vega Guidi, Sardus France, Thomas Trumbull, and Nuno Welder, and my executive producers Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, and Bogdan Kanivat. Thank you for all.